The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
We live in an age of endless information. We have classic news mediums such as newspapers, magazines, television, radio. But now we live in the information age, when content is key and everyone is fighting for a piece of the pie. These days, people are moving so fast that they only have time for headlines, which can be seen from a friend's Facebook post, whatever Twitter tells you is trending, or a brief scan of Google News. But we have definitely moved away from a time when you sat down with your morning coffee and read the newspaper cover to cover. Heck, the long-form dialogue from this podcast isn't everyone's cup of tea either. The point is that, like everything else in our lives these days, media is barely recognizable from what it was even 15 years ago. That change translates to the Jewish media as well. With the rise of more localized press coverage and online resources, previously established media fills a different role than it once did. This week on the Jewish Living Podcast, we invite on someone who knows a thing or two about established Jewish media.
My name is Elliot Resnick, and I am the chief editor of the Jewish Press.
Elliot and I will discuss these changes among a bunch of different factors that the Jewish media world needs to have in mind when covering their stories. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us this week. Let me start by asking you your background. How did you get into being the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Press?
Well, so actually my mother was friendly with the original owner and founder of the Jewish Press, Mrs. Irene Klass. She and her husband and her father founded the Jewish Press in roughly 1960. My mother was friendly with her. I went to Yeshiva University for college. Shortly after I graduated, I was looking for something to do. I think actually the year before I graduated, I worked for a summer at the Jewish Press. And then 2 years later, my mother and then I called and asked if they had any positions available. It turns out at the time they did have a position. They said, we're looking for somebody, a writer or a reporter. Do I think I could do it? I said I wasn't sure, but I will try. And I joined up, and I'm not a huge fan of the New York Times, but at the time it wasn't maybe as bad as it is today. So I sort of religiously read the Times for the next few days, not just for the news stories, but to see how they framed the news story. What goes first, what goes second. And that's how I started. That's 14 years ago. And then 2 years ago, they decided to make a switch, and they approached me and asked me would I be willing to become the editor. Till then, I was basically a writer for the last 12 years before that. I was editing some of the columns, some of the Torah columns, but I was doing mainly writing, mainly interviewing authors of books, heads of organizations. And since March 2018, now I've been the chief editor of the paper.
Interviewing editors, heads of organizations, and writers. I wonder what that's like. I don't know too many people who do that these days.
Good point.
So yeah, let's get into a little bit of the coverage that the Jewish Press does, specifically politics. You mentioned the New York Times and how you're not the biggest fan, but I want to talk to you about how the Jewish Press covers things like politics, things like Donald Trump, things like Benjamin Netanyahu, things like Barack Obama. And I say things; these are all people. But how do you go about covering these things when you're gearing it towards a very specific audience?
So as a writer for the Queen's Jewish Link yourself, you know this very well, that only really the biggest papers in the country have reporters, let's say in Yerushalayim or in Washington, D.C. The rest of us rely very heavily on the wire services. So like the JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the JNS, Jewish News Service. So for some of the bigger stories, for sure, we rely heavily on the wire services. That being said, we do sometimes try to supplement some of the big stories with original interviews. So for example, this week, there was a news story that Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center had closed down their coronavirus emergency wards. And we had an interview in the paper with the president of the Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center, Professor Yonatan Halevi, talking about what it was like to have these wards, what kind of treatment they gave these people, some statistics, old elderly people, mainly 80s and 90-year-olds, where they had, I think, 2 people in their 60s who passed away, 1 person in the 50s who passed away. So, and this interview was done by Tzvi Fishman, who is about Tshuva. He used to be a screenwriter in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. Before he became from, he moved to Israel around 30, 40 years ago. And he started working for us around a year ago, and he's gotten us many original interviews with people like Baruch Marzel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Steinberg. So we have, and many, many others. So we try to supplement big stories with sort of, in-depth interviews or even shorter interviews, kind of a little bit behind the scenes. That being said, you asked how we cover stories like, or people like Trump and Netanyahu. To a certain extent, we try to give readers what they want. Most Jewish press readers are right-wing, so we do try to give them more right-wing news. We're not going to sort of have a story about Joe Biden speaking to the local, Jewish Democrats of Florida. If you cover everything, then of course that has to be covered as well. But if you're only covering major stories, if I have to cover Biden giving a speech to the Jewish Democrats or Trump giving a speech to the Jewish Republicans, it's probably going to be Trump. Now, that being said, I do believe very heavily in being honest and fair. I'm very against editorializing in stories, even if it's people I don't like. So I'll just give you maybe an extreme example. Last year, JNS had a story with a headline, Talib accuses Israel of racist policies in quotation marks, that go back to 19th century segregation. Now, if you actually read the story, she does mention that Israel has racist policies, and then later on, a few sentences later, she mentions that separate but equal is not a proper policy to pursue. But I thought it was a big stretch to in a headline to use the words, racist policies that go back to 19th century segregation. First of all, separate but equal is not just 19th century. 19th century, you're starting to think about slavery. It also was in the 20th century, after slavery. Still terrible, but not the same thing as slavery. Second of all, to say that separate but equal is a racist policy, effectively in the South, it was a racist policy, but philosophically speaking, it's not necessarily a racist policy. There are people who argue that even Judaism believes in separate but equal in terms of how we treat men versus women. So I just thought it was a stretch to say that that when she talks about, accuse Israel of racist policies that go back to 19th century segregation, I just took out the second half of that headline. So just Talib accuses Israel of racist policies. Now, again, Talib is not a friend of Israel. I don't like Talib. I just believe in being fair. I don't like editorializing in an article. And that goes both ways. JNS, for whatever reason, every time they mentioned Donald Trump's Middle East peace deal, they would write the highly anticipated peace deal. That's an editorial comment. I don't know when it says highly anticipated, who was highly anticipating it? Certainly not the left, and most of the right wasn't anticipating it either. I would say a large part of the right was dreading it because they liked Trump, but they didn't want to have to criticize Trump. So every time they talked about the highly anticipated peace deal, I just took out the words highly anticipated. So to a certain extent, our readership is mostly right-wing. I do try to give them stories that I think they'll like, but at the same time, I do try hard to the best that I can, my ability, not to distort the facts.
I want to pick up on that in a second, but I want to go back to one thing that you said, just out of curiosity. Why wouldn't separate but equal be a racist policy?
Again, effectively in the South, it was used
right
in a racist fashion, but some people argue that maybe in Judaism, men and women are equal to a certain extent. Certainly in God's eyes, he doesn't. Well, it's obviously very confusing exactly how you word it, but there are people who would argue that men and women are inherently equal in Judaism, but nonetheless, there are different roles. So women have to be either upstairs, in the synagogue or on a separate section of the synagogue. They can't be in the same place and there's separate men's schools, separate women's schools. So in the South, they had separate white schools and separate black schools. If you have separate boys' schools and separate girls' schools, that means that they're inherently unequal. Why? The girls' schools could be just as good as the boys' schools. So
I think you'll have a lot of pushback as to why that would be the case. That it's not that separate but equal. It's not physically possible. It's not at all possible to have separate but equal. I don't really want to go further into that because I do want to get a lot of other topics. But one thing that you mentioned earlier is about how your readership is mostly right-wing and you try to cater it to that. So a while back, I had on the show Yaakov M., who is an opinion radio host, and he has a dial-in show that you can call. And I asked him this question. I'm going to ask it to you. Do you find that your politics and your writers' opinions influence your audience, or that your audience influences the way that you and your writers cover the stories?
That's a very interesting question. I guess I would say both ways, really. I mean, and even the example I gave before, maybe it's not a fair example. I'm also cognizant. So if Biden speaks to Jewish Democrats, I see that story, I have to pick certain news stories some weeks and leave out other stories. So if I see one week that Biden spoke to Jewish Democrats, I'll leave it out. If I see 2 or 3 weeks in a row, at a certain point, I'll say to myself, you know what? I'm not being honest to reality if I don't report it at least once. So, and you talked about readers, me influencing readers, readers influencing me. So if I'm doing something and I get, 2 or 3 emails or more saying, I really think, you should do more of this or less of that, I take that into consideration. I don't just ignore it. I try to then possibly change what I'm doing if I see that I'm getting some pushback either one way or the other. And I do get pushback from both sides sometimes. So
Right.
It goes both ways. I think we definitely a stupid thing like I was saying before, example, the words highly anticipated. If I left those words in, what you're doing is you're building up that peace plan. You're making it, wow, this is a tremendous peace plan coming up. It's highly anticipated. So if I use that word every single time, in a certain way, I'm subtly influencing my readers to value the plan. If I take it out, I'm making it more neutral. They can value it. They don't have to value it. So I think every news story, even objective news stories, you are subtly influencing readers one way or the other. But I do get feedback from readers, and
Right. So if you want to go further with that idea, would the feedback influence you to include highly anticipated in the byline or in the article itself? Like, would that be something that, oh, my readers seem to like this when I do this, so I'm going to include it, even though I know it's an editorial?
That I probably wouldn't, because I do feel very strongly to the best that I can. And the Jewish Press is a large paper, and it's like 100 pages, and there are a lot of stuff that go in. I can't be on top of everything, so I'm not saying everything meets my highest standards, but to the extent that I can, the things that I overlook directly, I very much believe in not putting editorial comments in a news article. If I see people want something more right-wing, something more left-wing, I could do that more with opinion articles or other ways of doing that. I do try very hard, though, not to put editorial comments in a news story.
All right, so being the Jewish Press, your leadership is basically entirely Jews, mostly Orthodox. If you have a choice between covering a national story or a local story, how do you make that decision? Obviously, with something that affects the Jewish community, you probably choose that. But if it's something that, let's say, isn't necessarily a Jewish community issue specifically, but let's say it's a New York localized story, but you have readers nationally. So are you going to be covering that New York story as if it's a front page thing versus if it's just a local story, you'll put it somewhere in the paper more hidden?
Now, this is a New York story that's not Jewish related.
New York story that's not Jewish related.
Yeah, we usually don't cover those too much. I try for the most part to put only Jewish stuff in the paper. I make some exceptions only because the other papers do, and I don't. And like for politics, I don't really think there's any room for discussion of American politics in a Jewish paper, unless it's from a Jewish angle, and there are plenty of Jewish angles. But just discussing whether I like Trump or I don't like Trump outside of Jewish context, I don't, in theory, believe it belongs in a Jewish paper. The problem is everyone does it, and so that's an example where I try to please my readers. So we do have one page kind of solely devoted to American politics. Now, otherwise, a New York story that's a news story that has nothing to do with the Jews, I don't usually cover that at all, really.
Okay.
I'm not like Hamodia. Hamodia covers stories that are just not Jewish related because they're assuming their readers are only reading Hamodia and nothing else. We don't operate like that. We operate more as a traditional Jewish paper where we're just covering Jewish stories.
So let me give an example. Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, says something that can be deemed anti-Semitic that you'll cover, but Bill de Blasio appoints his wife to a position not covering.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. So you mentioned other papers or what they do. Let's talk about the other papers. When I was growing up, Jewish Press was basically the paper. It was Jewish Press and the Forward. Maybe the Hamodia and the Yated were there also. But now it seems like every mid-sized Jewish community has their own publication. And I was wondering how that affects the Jewish Press, which is not necessarily directed at a specific community. I know you have different pages that cover, Queens and Long Island and Florida and a lot of different coverages like that. But how does the fact that each of these communities now has their own small publication affect the way that you cover the localized stories?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. There's no question about it. We had a monopoly once upon a time, and
Right.
it's very nice to enjoy a monopoly. And when I came to the paper, it was just, I think, after we sort of lost the monopoly. So we were very spoiled for a long time. Now we have a lot of competition. As you know, because you also work for a paper to a certain extent.
Yes, one of those localized mid-sized papers.
Right. Covering local stories is very hard because there's a dearth of writers, number one, out there. Number two, from people don't like speaking to the media very much. Which also makes it hard to do local stories. Look, as you know, a lot of organizations send in press releases. So if OHEL has their 50th dinner and they're honoring somebody and they're having a whole gala event, they'll send you a press release. It's all about it. So sometimes you can just take those press releases and edit them down and put them in the paper. And that's one way of, for instance, just today I got an email from the the Lawfare Project by any chance?
I'm not familiar.
It's Brooke Goldstein runs it. She went to Cardozo and she wanted to volunteer for an organization that was sort of defending Jewish civil rights. Kind of like, I hate to stereotype, but just for the sake of, this interview will just make it easier. If there's an issue that's of concern to the Black community, the Black community immediately sues in court. Or for women, the women immediately sue. There's always lawsuits going on all over the place on behalf of different ethnic groups. And she discovered that there are really no organizations devoted to suing on behalf of Jewish groups. Now, of course, each Jewish organization has certain interests. So Agudas Yisrael might sue for something having to do with yeshiva education, but there's no one organization devoted solely to suing for Jewish civil rights. So she founded an organization called the Lawfare Project. You might want to interview her. And she seems very interesting. We had an article. I actually wanted to interview her. It's on my agenda. So, for instance, I think there's a Kuwait, in airlines, they refuse to allow Israelis to fly on their airline. So she sued them and said, and she said, I don't know if it's illegal or it's illegal according to the, airlines regulations. And because of that, they no longer fly from London to JFK. They no longer, I think, fly anywhere in Europe. A lot of their flights had to be canceled because they refused to give in. But at the same time, what they were doing was unlawful according to either the law or unlawful according to internal airline regulations. There was a soccer, I think, tournament in Saudi Arabia. They weren't letting Israelis participate. They sued. And because I think the internal soccer international, I think maybe FIFA, whatever the main soccer organization, it went against their regulations. They had to move the whole tournament to Russia because Saudi. So this is what the organization does. So why did I mention? So I just got a press release today from them, saying that they just they filed a FOIL request, a Freedom of Information request with the city. They want to know any and all documents that de Blasio used to issue this tweet against the Jewish community. Why did he target the Jewish community and not other communities? And they sent a press release to us today, just with those, just telling us that, and then having a quote from Brooke Goldstein, I believe is her name, sort of commenting on why they filed this lawsuit. So I might just run that 2 or 3 paragraphs, so that, as you know, because you also work for a paper, that's some of these organizations send out these press releases. So sometimes you could cover local news by kind of working off these press releases, or the Zionist Organization of America. They send me a press release, so I find it very interesting. I might just call up Mort Klein and ask him for an original quote to go with that press release that he gave me. But outside these press releases, covering local stories is difficult. It is difficult. We try our best, and I try to pick stories I think will be of most interest to most people. So even if it's a local story, there are stories. I think Lipa Schmelzer's house was on fire once. That's just a headline that's going to interest people. Lipa Schmelzer's house on fire. So I saw that online somewhere, so I covered it. Not a huge story, but I covered it.
All right. It's a celebrity. It's a from celebrity whose house is on fire. For those gossip columnists, they love reading those things. The other thing that you guys have that other papers might not is that your paper is not free. A lot of these local papers, they survive exclusively basically on ad revenue. Now, for what we're in right now, the situation we're in with COVID, that's not the best way to do it, because a lot of the businesses that used to be able to advertise aren't able to do so right now. A lot of them are closed. That it holds true for you too. You're not getting that ad revenue, but you're still getting whatever it is, the dollar for the paper. So what's the difference between the way that you decide that your paper is going to be charged and versus a paper that runs on advertisements alone?
To be honest, I'm not so involved on the business end. It's my understanding, though, not being involved, that newspapers make most of their money off advertisements, right, not off subscription. Subscription, we do charge. There's an argument both ways whether to charge or not charge. I think for a paper like us to stop charging after 70 years, I have some Lubavitch connections in my family. So the Lubavitchers will give out these menorahs every Hanukkah. But apparently they charge like $1 or $2. And apparently that was on the directive of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said people value things more when they pay for it.
Yep.
So even if it's just $1 or $2 to pay for that tin menorah, they'll value it more.
I understand what you're saying. Especially, I don't know if you've ever been approached by a Breslov gentleman carrying a stack load of Svarim, and you give him like 50 cents and he'll give you like 6 Svarim. And I've never opened one of those in my life. But you're right. If these are things you're just giving away, people value them less. So we spoke a little bit about the localized stuff, but there's also new media out there, and things like this podcast, things like websites, the Yeshiva World, Vos is Nice, they're all out there. They're all covering these things, and they're all getting these stories out to the public basically immediately. There was a story this week about a man in Queens, a frum guy in Queens who was chasing off intruders in his yard with a gun. And his wife called the police, and the police came, and he was able to help the police apprehend one of the three men that the police have been looking for. And my paper, the Queens Jewish Link, is going to run a story about it this coming week. By the time this podcast airs, it's past week. But Vos is Nice and the Yeshiva World were able to get that out there immediately. The story ran on their sites right away. How does that affect a print media, which basically has to wait, especially a weekly one like the one that you run and the one that I work for? How do we handle those types of things?
It's very difficult. It is difficult. When I do the main news stories on page one and 2, I go to JNS, and I'll only take stories that appeared on JNS on Tuesday. So when you get the paper on Wednesday, the story's only 1 day old. Many people read the paper on Shabbos, though. If you're reading the paper on Shabbos, I can't get you any story that's later than Tuesday afternoon. It's problematic, and I'm always struggling with this. Some of our readers are older, so they're not really following the internet all week long, so it's not a big deal. There are others, even younger people, unless you're an absolute news junkie, I think there are a lot of stories that people miss. So, and also if you're a newspaper, you have to carry the major stories anyways, whether they read them or not. But that's why, sometimes to a certain extent, sometimes, relying on features or relying on doing in-depth interviews or things that are not going to get off the internet sometimes is the way to go. But you're right, in terms of regular news stories, I'm always concerned about that I'm giving them old stuff. And the only thing I could do is try to give them the latest stuff that I possibly have, or stuff which has not really appeared all over the place. It's not such a well-known story, in which case it's not a big deal if it's a few days old. So this week, I actually did a story on, I don't usually do stories, but I happened to do a story on this. There's a store owner in Upper East Side of Manhattan. He opened his clothing store in defiance of New York regulations. He said, I don't care. I need to make money. I'm losing my business. I'm going to have to fire my employees. I can't handle this anymore. And he opened his store. I found out that he actually happens to be Jewish, and he volunteered for the IDF during the Yom Kippur War. So I kind of did a story on that. Now, the story's kind of already a week old, or by now a little bit older. I actually put it on our website right away, but I put it in the paper anyways, even though it was older, because I figured how many people have heard of this story. Right. But
So as I'm an opinion columnist, so it's a little bit different. Opinions are, everybody's got opinions, but because I'm not really covering events, I'm giving an opinion on things. I tend to be able to overcome a lot of that. I'm not covering something per se, but often you're printing on Tuesday. My paper prints on Tuesday. My deadline to write it used to be Friday. Now it's Sunday. Still, even if by the time I write an opinion, that could have been already debunked by the time, like something could have come out by the time it goes to print, by the time it's 6 days later, by the time Shabbos comes and people are reading it. So what I started doing personally is I started writing about things that happened way in the past that new information necessarily isn't coming out about, and I find some sort of a new angle to cover it with. Or, like you said, you cover something that isn't exactly totally covered by a lot of the news outlets that maybe the mainstream Orthodox community is reading. But you're covering events, you're spot on. That's exactly right. It's a little bit difficult when a lot of people might have had it, unless you have the older readership.
Right, and then you sometimes try to do is instead of, let's say, Israel tends to hold elections Monday or Tuesday, but let's say they held it on Thursday. So I'm not going to run a headline, Netanyahu wins the election 5 days later. What you could do is Netanyahu, busy formulating his coalition after his victory, after his election victory. You make it about the post, the post event rather than the event itself. So, things like that. So workarounds sometimes.
Yep, absolutely. So in terms of what everybody's covering, do you as the editor of the Jewish Press have relationships with the other publications, with the editors or the owners of other publications, and the way that you cover things? Do you guys ever coordinate on how these things are covered?
The answer is basically no. I think one of the heads of your paper, Yaakov Searle, is he one
Yes.
of the heads?
Mm-hmm.
So he used to work for the Jewish Press, and I've met him at a few events, and I know him from before, so we schmooze a little bit. I schmooze with some other people that I've met, at events. Somebody from AMI, somebody from I forget another publication, but almost no interaction. I mean, there was once something I got. There was it was once something I was involved in that I was getting a little bit of backlash for. So one of these editors, not the main editor, but one of the editors at one of the other papers, kind of wrote me an email saying I support you and kudos to you for what you're doing. But other than that, almost no interaction with any of the other papers. I'm not sure that's good or bad, but basically no interaction.
Well, I don't know. If you watch a lot of, I mean, there was a story maybe 2 years ago at this point when there was a company that bought out a lot of news organizations across the country, a lot of TV stations, and you saw a video compilation of the anchors of all of those news stations reading out the same statement, and it looked very bad for the owners of the company that they were just like mandating that this news thing be read out loud, and it looked like it was a coordinated attack, and they weren't all like, oh, it's all Fox or all NBC or all CBS. It was like a variety of different stations that were bought out, and it didn't really add up. So that's where that question came from. Like, should there be an appearance of some sort of a collusion on how things are covered? I just was curious about that.
Yeah, no, never on that. I mean, as I'm thinking now, there has sometimes if there's a story that for some reason I can't cover a particular week, I have sometimes been in contact with Busses Nias. I'll write to them saying, do you mind if I use this story as long as I give you credit? I try to cover things independently. So for that, I've had a little contact with them and one or two other places, more local stuff. But no coordination. I've never had that.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the successes and failures of the media, not the general media. We can go on forever about that. I want to focus specifically on the Jewish press, places where you feel like you really hit it out of the park, and places where you think you guys can do better, areas of improvement.
Interesting question. Well, I've only been in charge for 2 years. In my 2 years, I mean, I'm proud of a lot of things that are in the paper, but if you're thinking about a series, a Pulitzer Prize series, that's not really what we've been doing. I've been focusing more on features, interesting interviews, interesting articles about, Rav Soloveitchik's 25th yard site. I had someone write a lengthy article all about him, had some excerpts from stories about him. So the things that I take pride in are more featurey type things, not so much the news coverage, which is what you're probably asking for, especially the bigger stories. Often I'm relying on the wire services. The things I'm more proud of are the feature stuff, or a lot of interviews that I've done or other people have done. I'm proud when I get those type of interviews. I think a lot of them are interesting. Whether I did them or someone else did them is really irrelevant. In terms of the information, getting the information out there. In terms of what I think we need improvement on, you keep on asking about local stories. This is where I really feel that we're not as good as we could be, and I'm always really wanting to be better. The problem is that there are a lot of obstacles to getting really good local coverage, and specifically local from coverage. That's difficult for several reasons. Number one, there's really a dearth of writers. There are not so many reporters out there, especially reporters who know the Haredi world and could write about the Haredi world intelligently. Second of all, it's very hard to get quotes from the main people in the Haredi world. The Haredi world does not like speaking to the media. Outside the Haredi world, there's an ethos if the media calls you, you're supposed to respond. You're supposed to give them a statement. The Haredi world doesn't have that ethos. They don't really care if you call them. They're not interested in speaking to you. And I don't really blame them entirely. They've been burned by the media many times, and they have sort of they'll trust you. If you're their next door neighbor, they know you, fine. If they don't know you, they're not interested. If they want to get a message out there, they'll get the message out there in their own way. They'll give a mussar schmooze. They'll do something else. They're not interested in having to be the subject of a reporter. Kind of like, they live or die based on what the reporter does. He'll speak to the reporter for 10 minutes, and maybe the reporter will get it right. Maybe he won't. Maybe he'll quote this statement. Maybe he won't quote that statement. So the Haredi world doesn't really. I was once assigned to a story maybe 5-10 years ago. Lipa Schmeltzer, probably 10 years already, was having a musical concert in Madison Square Garden, and there were people who thought it was inappropriate, that his music was too jazzy, too rocky. They made a whole big stint out of it, and they got whoever was organizing it to cancel the entire concert. I think Moshe Laufer organized the concert. It was a big deal at the time, that a Madison Square Garden concert was canceled. And I was asked to write a story on it. And I immediately knew I didn't want to write this story. And all my fears were proven correct, because no matter who I called, no one would speak to me. The main rabbis who actually, I think they had signed a public statement that people should not go to this concert. None of them wanted to speak to me. Some people were even lying to me. Like one of these rabbis, the children said, "Oh, my father's not home." In the meantime, I think I heard his father in the background. And I even said to him, I said, "Look, I get where you're coming from. You could just tell me my father doesn't want to speak to you. You don't have to lie to me. There's no reason for it." But they were so scared. I could see. I think I called up one yeshiva. Is the Rosh Yeshiva available for me to speak to? Oh no, he's out of town. They're scared to speak to you. So how can I write a decent story on this event if the only person who wants to speak to me is the person who organized the whole concert? But it doesn't matter. He was the only one who would speak to me. I couldn't get anybody on the other side. So how do you cover from stories well if they won't speak to you? And the only chance of them speaking to you, I think, is if somebody they'll trust. And again, there's a dearth of writers. It's just difficult. So I really want to be better on that. It's always one of my aims, but right now I think it's one of our weaknesses, I would say.
All right, so that's it's our second time Lipa made it into this podcast. Very good plug for Lipa. I actually remember that concert.
Sorry, I didn't necessarily mean to give him a plug. Actually,
that's fine.
I actually find. I'm not so sure if we really want someone to be called the Hasidic Lady Gaga. I don't know if Hasidic and Lady Gaga really should go together. But anyways, that's irrelevant. But it's fine.
Right.
Anyways,
but I actually
these
remember.
Are just examples that
I remember
mind.
when that concert was canceled. That was a big deal. And I completely just lost in my memory. But now that you're bringing it up, yeah, I do remember that actually happening. And no, I do not remember who organized the concert at the time. But I remember it being a big deal. But this leads me kind of into the next topic that I want to hit, which is how you go about covering these events or specific events, given that your audience is who they are. So when you're covering things like sexual misconduct, whether it's amongst politicians or within our own community, that's kind of a big deal. It's a touchy subject. I don't know if I didn't see it on your website, but I was looking at a bunch of other things. I don't know if you covered the Netflix series Unorthodox. I'm just curious how you cover these types of things, given your audience, especially the more touchy subjects.
So just a note before I begin to answer, the Jewish Press website is kind of semi-independent from the print edition.
Okay.
It has its own independent editor who makes his own independent decisions. So just that's the way it's been for the last 10 years or so. Okay. Any interesting article in the print edition automatically goes up on the website. The website has many, many more articles than the print edition. It's run out of Israel. So it's kind of a separate operation to a certain degree. Okay. Sensitive topics. Yeah, it is sensitive. Most of these scandals came out before I was in charge, so I really haven't had to really make any major decisions in that regard. Again, certainly if it's not a Jewish topic, I'm not going to cover it. If it is a Jewish topic, I don't know. It's a good question. Honestly, it has never really come up so much yet. So that's about the best I can tell you, really.
So there are a lot of stories with allegations of misconduct amongst the frum community. I'm not saying it's like more in our community than other communities. I think it exists in our communities like it exists in other communities. Those types of things, are those things that you cover easily? Are those things that you have to have pause about? Do you guys? I'm assuming you have a rabbinic authority that you ask about certain things that before you put it in. So are these questions, when these questions come up, what do you guys do?
It is a good question. I think sometimes the answer is not, at certain stages, the answer is not so difficult. So at a certain stage, certain rabbis, their name is all over the news. So I'm going to backtrack a teeny bit. There was one rabbi in Israel. His name was all over the news. And someone wrote kind of like an opinion article saying, I really love this rabbi. I even translated some of his farm into English. And I always wanted to believe that maybe it was a one-time mistake and he made tshuva. But I see now it's not true because he sort of reverted. And he wrote this whole long, heartfelt article. I ran it because his name was all over the news anyways. I didn't feel like I was breaking a story, that's a sort of lashon hara that no one knew about. If you were paying attention to the news, everyone knew about him anyways. So some of those people, if their names are already out there and other people have already made them famous, I don't think it's necessarily, the decision is as hard. If it's not known and it's at the very beginning stages, then it's a much more difficult decision, and it hasn't really come up yet. I'm not sure it's a mitzvah for me to be the first one to really publicize things, especially because in every single one of these stories, there's always two sides. The other person always claims it's not really true or it's misunderstood. And there are times where it's not like every single time it is true. There are times that the claims are either not true or exaggerated. So it's not like no one's ever been framed at all. So I don't know if it's a mitzvah for me to be the first one to, talk about somebody if it's not really out there yet. It's not really been confirmed that's pretty much true. But like I said, in the last 2 years, no situation has really come up where I had to really kind of grapple with that. So not sure so much.
All right. And the other fireball topic that always comes up is printing women's faces. Now, I know the Jewish press does that, but I wanted to get your opinion on that annoying topic that I absolutely hate the topic, but I'm asking it anyway. A couple of people reached out to me and asked me if I would ask you that.
So we've always printed women's pictures. I don't see the problem. Look, I represent the Jewish press. The Jewish press believes in publishing women's pictures. I personally also have zero problem with it. But I do understand the other side, and I don't bash them. I don't think they deserve to be bashed. I don't think they're doing it because they're erasing women from history. I don't think they're erasing anything. I think this is just a value in their community. It's like people say, outside our community, oh, we're being so evil to our women, we make them cover their hair. No, we're not being evil to them. The women believe in it. They want to cover their hair. They think it's God's will to cover their hair. A lot of people in the Haredi community, not all, I know there's a lot who think it's ridiculous, but there's a significant chunk, maybe even a majority, that really believes that they shouldn't be in the limelight. And so we're not erasing them. It's like, we all believe in the same values. We believe in those values, and the women also believe in those values. They really believe that God wants that. So I get the other side of the argument. I personally think there's no problem with it. My paper certainly doesn't think there's any problem with it. There are cases where a woman, especially if I'm interviewing, if there's a story about a woman in the paper, and and maybe her tznius standards are kind of like borderline. That kind of picture, I'm not going to make it huge. I'll make it kind of like average size. I'm not going to make it huge because. Again, some people will think it's crazy, but I do think that we do believe kind of sort of tznius type of things. We do believe in tznius, and if the woman, her tznius standards are kind of very much borderline, certainly, she's not from, and we have people who are not from in the paper. I'm not going to make it a huge picture. I'll make it as a decent sized picture. I'm not going to make it huge though, because we will get complaints because our readership is very mixed. We have non-Orthodox, we have people who are more black hat, who have bought us for 50 years. They will complain. And you also think it sounds silly in terms of borderline issues. We have times where the women is, she's wearing short sleeves, but it's not super short. It's kind of short, a little bit above the elbow, not very much above the elbow. So if we're not sure, well, honestly, we'll ask like 2 or 3 people at the office, what do you think? Do you think we should put it in? We'll kind of like get a feeling. There's some women at the office. What do you think? Do you think people will complain if we put this in? And we kind of feel out, it's kind of like, and by the way, a lot of tznius issues are kind of like a feeling, is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? So sometimes a lot of borderline cases we'll kind of put in, but if it's super not borderline, if she's sleeveless, we won't put it in a sleeveless. If her cut is very, very low, we will put it in. If it's slightly low, we will put it in. But it's kind of like, these are just judgment calls, really. Just, I don't know. But I don't know what to say. I do know somebody who bought the Jewish press years ago because Rebbetzin Palm passed away, Rav Palm's wife, and she knew the Jewish press would be the only publication that would have a picture of Rebbetzin Palm, and so she bought the Jewish press.
Does your paper have a rabbinic authority that you consult on things, or do you kind of fly by popular opinion in the office?
That's a good question. We do have a rabbi who's the nephew of the original founder of the Jewish press. But I must say there are times there are a lot of times we just judgment calls kind of, what can I tell you? I mean, look, you have your own podcast. I'm sure you make your own judgment calls. Should I don't know. I won't give examples because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm sure there are people you might think to yourself, should I interview this person? Should I not? Is this person really not from? So am I giving the wrong message to the community if I interview this person? You make your own calls. Like, maybe you consult a rabbi, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm sure you don't consult a rabbi on all issues. So we kind of have to consult our own consciousness sometimes and think, because everything that goes on your podcast and everything that goes in my paper, we are ultimately responsible for. So yeah, it goes both ways to a certain extent in terms of, what you have in the paper. In a certain way, don't get me wrong, in a certain way, I'm dying to interview a responsible member of Neturei Karta, not a Neturei Karta person who goes to Iran and hugs the Arabs, but an Turk Carter person who does not do that. I mean, he doesn't put Jewish lives in danger. He just principally believes that the state of Israel is a disaster. I honestly would love to carry an interview with a person like that, but the Jewish press is a very Zionist paper, and it's a non-starter with the ownership and with a lot of our readers. So I won't do it for that reason. So I'm saying it's right wing and left wing. You have to make judgment calls sometimes in these type of things. But I would never interview someone from the Turk Carta who goes to the Arabs, because then in a certain way I would be responsible for promoting somebody who really I think is putting Jewish lives in danger. So.
Right, I hear that. You would definitely get pushback for giving that person a platform. I'm with you. I don't mind giving people a platform. I don't have to agree with them, but it's good to know other people's opinions so that you know how to argue with them if you disagree with them. We shouldn't be afraid to hear other people's opinion, unless, as you said, it's putting other people's lives in danger. I just want one more thing about the tznius issue. I don't know if you have anything to do with the advertisements that go in the paper, but let's say an organization, a yeshiva, a school, something, a shul, they're having a dinner and they want to put an advertisement in your paper that's honoring Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, and there's only a picture of Mr. Are you going to be taking that ad, or are you going, because I've seen those ads, not necessarily in your paper, but I've seen them, they exist. So I'm curious how you would handle that type of a request.
There was an ad just like that, but they had two versions. The one in the Jewish press actually had the woman's picture, and the one that ran in other papers did not have the woman's picture. I'm not in charge of what ads we accept, what we don't accept. There actually are ads in the past that I kind of wrote to somebody saying, I don't think this is appropriate for our paper. I'm not in charge of the ads, so I'm not going to, but I'm just. We once had an ad. I don't know how it got in the paper. They were advertising some trip. They claimed the trip was kosher food, but no mashgiach at all. No kashrus organization at all was putting their stamp on it. I said, how can we put this in the paper? But it wasn't my call. But I did bring it to the attention of the people whose call it was, and they ultimately actually did not put the ad in the paper. I'm not in charge. Look, at the end of the day, I think they probably would accept it. I mean, most papers accept most ads. I was just reading a book. Jewish papers were accepting ads from Henry Ford in the 1920s. As Henry Ford was publishing excerpts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his own newspaper, which is obviously an anti-Semitic book, they were accepting ads from him. Newspapers very, very rarely turn down advertisements. The New York Times ran advertisements from Meir Kahane. It's very rare for a newspaper to, because it's not their responsibility. An advertisement is known and understood that it's being paid for by somebody else. So it's not under your auspices. You don't have to. Right. You're not endorsing it. I think it has to take a huge extreme for a newspaper to reject an ad.
Okay. I posted on social media that if anybody had any questions for you, they could send them in, and we would ask them to you on air, if that's all right.
Sure thing.
All right. So the first question comes from Josh Silber, who asks, how do you toe the line between journalism and Lashon Hara? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to give you another opportunity to go for it. It's
a great question. I don't have a good answer. I just don't. I have actually always been meaning to look more seriously into it. Look, there's several problems. One of the problems is that what Lashon Hara to one person is wonderful to another person. So if I say to the Haredi world that Rabbi Tendler went on the Har HaBayis, for them that's Lashon Hara because it's also to go on the Har HaBayis. But to a religious Zionist, he might be a hero for going on the Har HaBayis. So who determines what's Lashon Hara and what's good news? Maybe we shouldn't do this, but to a certain extent, a lot of us in life do this. We assume that if most From people are doing something, it's probably okay. I don't think I'm doing anything different than any other From newspaper does and has been doing for 100 years. So I don't necessarily feel I have to go out tomorrow and ask a shayla if all I'm doing is the same thing that every other Jewish newspaper and From newspaper has done for 100 years. If it ever comes to an issue which is different than what any Jewish newspaper has done, fine. So like I said before, a child molester, if it's not known that he's a molester, I'm going to be the first one publicizing it. I think that's kind of maybe falls into the Lashon Hara category. But then again, people say, well, it's not just Lashon Hara. You're also putting kids' lives in danger if you don't put it in. So that's why there's always two sides of the coin, right? It's not just about Lashon Hara if you publicize something. It's also if you don't publicize it, you might be harming people because you might be harming the next child who will be that student or that teacher. So there's always both sides of the coin. In the meantime, I assume that if I'm doing what everybody else has done for 100 years, I assume that I'm basically doing okay. But I agree with you. It's an issue. I do. If you know any great articles that have explored this topic in depth, the interplay between Lashon Hara and journalism, I actually would love to read it. To be honest.
Right. If any of our listeners out there know of one, you could send it to us on Twitter. Elliot's also tagged in our posts on Twitter, so you can always respond with those articles if you know of one. I have one more question from @Moshe_Kolat, who asks, how do the tweets of the week get selected?
So I rummage through different tweets. Some of the tweets are on my Twitter feed, and sometimes I just, if I've taken tweets from the person before, I might just go back to that person's Twitter account and see what he's posted recently. And I just look for interesting, funny, incisive tweets, and I pick those. Going back to an earlier question, every once in a while, if I see the person is also posting like, either, dirty jokes or has off-color language, if he does a lot of that, I sometimes hesitate. Do I really want to publicize that person's, Twitter account? Do I really want people going on there? But, if it's more or less kosher. And look, the short answer is I just rummage through tweets. Some of them are my Twitter account, my Twitter feed. Others I just kind of look around and I just pick the ones that I think people will like. I don't pick, even though we're a right-wing readership, anything below the belt I try not to pick. So even though most of our readers are Republicans, I'm not going to pick something that's below the belt that attacks like Biden personally or that says that all Democrats are stupid. I just think it's kind of like not nice because not every one of our readers is Republican. It's a Jewish newspaper at the end of the day. So I do have things which are sort of, maybe anti-left, but I try to make it more, at least not personal to people's, not that the leftist is dumb. Like there was once even, I felt it was kind of funny. You probably would laugh if you saw it too, but it's like it was juvenile humor. It had a picture of Jerry Nadler, but he looked like an old 80-year-old man. He had his pants like lifted up halfway up his chest, and he looked absolutely ridiculous. And everyone hates Jerry Nadler, for many reasons. He voted for the Iran deal, and now Trump people hate him for what he did to Trump. And so, and the picture looked hilarious. I just thought it was like below the belt because you're making fun of somebody's looks, even though people would laugh and love it. It was kind of funny. I just didn't think it was appropriate. So, again, I try to find funny and incisive tweets, but it's, at the same time, I try not to sort of insult people personally or do things which are sort of juvenile maybe.
All right, I'll let you plug 2 people that you like following on Twitter for funny and incisive tweets.
Well, I do a mixture of Jewish stuff and non-Jewish.
Give me the Jewish stuff. This is the Jewish Living podcast.
Yeah, well, I've only started branching out recently. I Gil Student I've been following for a long time. I'll take stuff from him. Who else do I take from? And the person you asked that question from, I've taken stuff from him also.
Moshe
Kolap. And I've taken somebody else. The person who liked that tweet.
That was
something AM, I think was.
Yeah, it was. I'm looking at it right now. It was AIM Humor. Oh yeah, AIM Humor has written into things on the show also, and on the on our Twitter feed.
So
all right,
I've taken those.
All right, very good. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we let you go?
I would just, we've been around for quite some time. I would say it depends. Obviously, we kind of cater to everybody in a certain way. What I mean, I'll rephrase that. What I mean is that we're not fully Haredi, we're not fully modern Orthodox, we're kind of in the middle. Some people think that's a disadvantage. I could see why people would say that, but we kind of continue to be, in a certain way, kind of like 1960s Orthodoxy. We're frum, but we're also very Zionistic. That's why, we always have stuff about Israel, but we're right-wing politically. And we're kind of an interesting mixture, and we're 100 pages. I always say we have something for everybody. We have Haredi writers, and we have Jonathan Sachs. So we kind of have something for everybody. And if you haven't read the Jewish Press in a while, I would encourage you to sort of pick up a copy and see if you like some of the changes we've made in the past few years.
All right. Where can people find more of your stuff? And if you want to plug anything else, I'll let you do that now.
Best thing is Facebook. You can find me on Facebook at Elliot Resnick, I believe. I'm there. That's where I post Jewish material from the Jewish Press.
All right.
And I'd love for you to join me.
Elliot Resnick, thank you for joining us this week.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
My thanks to Elliot Resnick for spending a little time with us this week. Elliot spoke a little bit about the dearth of writers in the Jewish community, but hey, some of us got our weekly column because of that dearth. So it can work out in the end. If you have any questions on the topics we covered this week or any other week, reach out to us on social media and let us know. Until next time, as always, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Swirly Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.